Welcome, everybody, to this very special episode of A Story Always, in which we have the great pleasure of being joined by Kieron Gillen.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Before we get with the actual interview, let me do the proper spamming, as I'm contractually obligated by Twitch, my great overlords, to remind you to please become follow us on Twitch to get notifications when we go live to do this kind of the next time we do this kind of thing. And if you want to support the channel and get access to the video the moment we stop streaming, you can become a subscriber on Twitch. And if you have Amazon Prime and you are not using that, you can get it for free. Use that shit. It's not going to it's just laying around. Also, if you want to see the videos of after the streams, you can also subscribe to YouTube, get all the videos there and all that kind of stuff, and follow us on social media on Twitter and Facebook and all of that. With that out of the way, I want to welcome our guest for today. Hi, Kieron. Thanks a lot for being here.
It's lovely to be here, and I thank our overlords for allowing it to be so.
I'll tell them later. So, first of all, for those of you who don't know who Kieron is, he's a comic writer who has worked in a plethora of really cool comic books. Among some of them, you have the Journey into Mystery series, the Uncanny X-Men, the Young Avengers, and as an independent author for. He has worked in Phonogram, The Wicked, and The Divine, which have the first volume here, which is really cool. And more recently, in together with Stephanie Hans and Clayton Kohler, he has been working in Die.
Actually, I stress it's not like that anyway. In that I've run out of shelf space for comics. So, like, my own books, this shelf is my books. So I basically have to now put this book like this until I work out how I can change it. But it works for product placement. It works for product placement too.
Yeah. Very convenient. So why don't you give us the quick introduction about what is Die about?
Die is basically me and Stephanie Hans. Stephanie Hans I met when doing a book called Journey into Mystery. She was the cover artist. She did the final issue. And for the final issue is like one of the books people always talk to me about and people really respond to. So it was like, me and Stephanie should do something together. And like Stephanie's never done a book by herself. So it's like, let's do a fantasy book together. And, because with Stephanie's art, it was like, oh no, it has to be a fantasy book. The idea of a Stephanie Hans fantasy book is something the world clearly needs. And I was basically walking around. Actually, you don't need to hear the origin story. Basically, Goth Jumanji is the way I describe it, which is my 2-word pitch. Like, my actual full pitch is longer. It's a story of basically it's a portal fantasy. It's in 1991, 6 teenagers sat down to play a role-playing game, a homebrewed RPG, relevantly. They just disappeared. No one knew where they went. 2 years later, 5 of them turned up again. They couldn't talk about where the other one had gone. Now it's 25 years later, and things are coming back to haunt them. So basically, it's a story about people who disappeared into a fantasy world at 16 and stayed there for a couple of formative years, coming back as adults. So it's about comparing their teenage fantasies, this idealized idea of where they thought the life was going to be, with how they're actually dealing with their life as 40-somethings. So it basically uses a lot of RPG tropes. But at the same time, it also uses it to sort of drill down into kind of like, why the hell did my life go wrong? That's what people seem to like about it. And it's a broad deconstructive fantasy about why we care about RPGs anyway and how much they might have cost us and stuff like that.
Cice. So talking about RPGs, how did you get into RPGs?
I'm of an age. I'm going to lean back and light a cigarette and get a brandy. I'm trying to work out the exact. I was born in 1975, so I would have been 7 when Red Box came out. So I wasn't, obviously I'm not first generation RPG, but like I was around when it was breaking into pop culture. Like some of my, appearing in ET and stuff as an early memory. So it being part of the cultural conversation. And I was somebody who, my family are firmly working class, but I was brought up around I was also very much encouraged to read books. That was the kind of, it was very much that kind of working class background. So I was immediately, fact, it was in the cultural conversation. It was attractive and interesting. So I was into like the fighting fantasy books, like all the choose your own adventure books, and all this kind of like. And I had a friend who was a few years older than I was. I had a friend who was my age who had brothers who were older than he was. So he got all their stuff early. That kind of like I was an older child and he was the youngest child. So whereas youngest childs get the hand-me-downs and get access to older stuff earlier.
Yeah, trickle-down economics, but it works for real.
Exactly like that. But weirdly, it actually works instead of like real trickle-down economics.
Yes.
So like he had like a computer and all this kind of, so he had access to a computer and access to like some older fantasy stuff. So it's always kind of like forbidden fruit for me, or rather like stuff I just couldn't have. So I got Middle-earth role-playing when I was either 10 or 11. I think might have been 11. Well, no, it'll be 10. But last year of like primary school, which was entirely incomprehensible to me. As in, like, Merps is a cut-down roll master, and over the next like couple of years, we sort of learned the system. So I started off just by cutting out the cardboard figures and pushing them around the table. But and then it basically followed me across my teenage years. So it's that kind of like, but at the same time, I was very into like a lot of fantasy novels, a lot of science fiction novels, and video game culture, and like a lot of the whole kind of that space in the 1980s. So it kind of all kind of percolated together, really.
Was there something different for you about the experience of playing an RPG and the kind of stories and fantasy you played back then from kind of all the other media, the books, the choose your adventure, that kind of stuff? Something that back then you thought was different?
Okay, there's a story I've told several times as a games critic. So I used to write about mainly video games, but not just video games. But that friend of mine, he was basically, there was a Hobbit game on the Spectrum, and the way that he described the actually, this is a very downbeat story, but like bear with me, it does go somewhere. So on the walk, we had to walk to the swimming baths, like with like 5 or so. So like we held hands and we walked to the swimming pool, and then we swam and walked back. And every week for like, it felt like months, it was probably only a week or two. He used, on the way there, he used to tell me about the game, The Hobbit. And in like, he like, oh man, we've got to the spiders, and if you do this, the spiders will kill you. And then it's, we're trapped in the dungeons, and I fell over, and but when the lights go out, it hurts. And then I wait till dawn, and the trolls turn to stone, and I'm like, this is literally the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. This exists. And of course, it took me a few weeks to go and visit my friend's house. And he loads it up, and this text adventure appears, and it's like, you never told me it was just text. Which is the kind of like, and for me, that's my relationship with most games in terms of like this conceptual idea of what it is versus the hard reality of what it is. And over the years, I've come more to, the difference is interesting, as in what is fantasy and what is our attempt to actualize a fantasy. So it's like, and it all kind of like boils down to the question of agency. And so my favorite thing about being old is, I was kind of like, I was into pop music. I was very into pop music. Like a lot of my comics were about pop music, and I was always kind of waiting for a generation gap. Like in terms of like, because people talk about, all this new music sounds like noise to me, and I've never had that. And it was a bit sad because it's like, that means pop music has not changed enough. As in, I should, it should have changed enough to alienate me. And I'm now, anything you play, I'll go, oh no, I get that. Or I may not like it, but like I understand the elements that go into it. Conversely, the generation gap hit me with streaming, in that I could not understand why anyone would want to watch a game being played, and that's it's like, and that was because for my generation, the attraction was you always were doing it. The point was the idea of watching something was not what I got into gaming for. I mean, it's obviously some of my best friends are streamers, you know, and there's a lot, and there is definitely some streaming stuff I watch, but the idea of it being a primary form of consumption, that was, for me, the fact that you got to basically get your hands dirty. That was like, oh, this is new. This is like nothing else in human history. And especially like, I've interviewed a lot of like video game developers, like especially second generation video game developers, like so mid 80s. And I remember this quote from I've got the guy, Rise of Legends designer Brian, not Reynolds, maybe Reynolds. I forgot his name. But he was like, all we did was trying to work out a way to make a computer play D&D. Because if we can make a computer play D&D, we never have to do anything ever again. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like, that's so much as doesn't matter whether it's a board game or like the whole design system isn't, the goals are unachievable for me. And that's kind of part of the magic of RPGs, and any of it is how experience ascends from mechanics and the epiphenomenon. Okay, we're going deep nonsense.
Yeah, the emergent properties. The
emergence, like the epiphenomenon that is like what gaming is, and the magic, all the magic circle. I mean, it's called the magic circle. You know, that should be the clue. So yeah, that's what I like about games. That's a very long answer.
No, I think it's a really good answer. Does your experience with RPGs influence your work on other kind of fiction like comic books and stuff like that?
Good question. I don't know. The problem is like RPGs entirely define how I think, or like games per se have been such a major part of my, not the only part of mine, but like they've been such a big part of me that they cannot help but define. So I do tend to think in terms of mechanization. I tend to think about in terms of structure, as in there's a part of me there's like the machines of it all. I like to be able to like be like cogs. There's various books I've done. I did a book called Ubo, which is like a World War II comic, and I've had various people say, "Oh no, you can sort of see the war game rules," because like if you look at the game, sort of the actual comic, how the interactions are. Oh no, I can see the stats. As in, oh yeah, this class will always beat this class will always beat this class, and this class will always beat this class. So rock paper scissors setup. So like, and of course, you know, this eventually comes into die. Like there's a concept of eternal pressure, which is kind of like they're predominantly inspired by the Kriegspiel games of like Germany in the 19th century. But you know, like that. The idea of like there's so much of the military technology from the 19th century military technology which goes right into the RPG. That's like one of the big strands into it. So, but like, you know, the idea of mechanisms as a way of thinking, that's in there, I guess. World building, I guess, is in the mix. The concept of agency, occasionally, like you think about. I was on a phone call with a Hollywood person recently, and he'd only just played his first D&D game, and he was like, "Oh no, I get why so many writers like D&D. It's because of it's like a writer's room." And in my experience of very limited experience of horror, it's kind of like that. You get a group of people together and you work out, and especially if story game stuff. Like I mean, a lot of my like comic book writer friends, I've never played like a story game with like my people who would play that game, but it would work. You know what I mean? There's sort of like, I don't want to list names of people who would do that. Like, no, I want to play a game with those people, and it's fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one of the, especially RPGs. One of the great joys of playing an RPG is the band metaphor. Like you're getting groups together and you're jamming together, and like you'll create the creative synergy in terms of, okay, we're going to make something that's bigger than all of us together, and that's like a democratization of storytelling and experience, which is amazing. You know.
Yeah, and it's harder and harder to find these days, I think. Like, as much as I love streaming and watching streams of RPGs, you do lose that kind of stuff of actually being participant in creating a story communally with other people that I think is really hard to replicate or find anywhere else.
It is like nothing else. I mean, they're not. There's a thing called Questing Time. A friend of mine runs, and which is basically it's a pub-based performance RPG thing. Mainly like there's mainly improv comedians, so it's jokey. I've been a guest a couple of times, which is well out of my level. But I was chatting to a guy there, and he can't organise to play games, but for him, going along to see Questing Time or something like that is enough to scratch the itch. You know, like that works for me. And that's the thing about something like there's other. Not that saying streaming or anything is a replacement for playing, but they're complementary things that can interlink. I mean, like I talk about, I don't play video games anymore. Like I used to be a video game critic, moderately infamous, but about 5 years ago, I've stopped playing video games properly, and I just haven't got time. But it's also I scratch that itch by playing role-playing games or board games. And I do it that way because it means I also get together with my friends. Like the video games I like are quite solitary, and I have not got the time to be solitary. Like if I actually play a game, I get to A, scratch that ludic itch, B, see my friends, quite often drink. So like 3 urges together, as opposed to one urge. You know what I mean? Like there's when I was a games critic, I was very into the idea of utilitarian games. The idea of that games are utilitarian, as in the same way you might listen to certain music at certain points in your life. You play certain games. Like I remember, like there was a time I was really into like 2-minute games. Like they're really very quick web games, and that's because I wanted that. I wanted just like give me a hit, I'm gone. and like I wrote articles about breakup games, like games you would play when you were sad and split up with somebody, and you want something to disappear into. In the same way you would listen to Nick Cave records or drink red wine, you'd be playing, Planescape Torment, and that's the same with like RPGs as well. Like something like a classic, like a trad game where if you can get the group together over a period of weeks and go on this building stuff together, that's a wonderful journey. That's something, but you really mostly need to be able to like reliably get together. Whilst you've got a game that works better in like a one-off game, or like a lot of the story, a lot of like the Powered by the Apocalypse works well in those short seasons. That really suits my life because also I get bored. I don't want to run a game for like years. Like, but give me next 6 weeks we're going to play Blaze in the Dark. Go, and then we'll stop, and then we'll do something else. You know what I mean? And that suits my life right now. Yeah, so that's kind of part of the thing.
So getting back to Die a little bit, you started to talk a little bit about this, but how did the idea for Die came about?
I must admit, this bugs me. I can't remember when I decided exactly I would do an RPG. Because it was like, I think part of it just felt natural. A friend of mine, Lee Alexander, who used to be a games critic and now is like a generalized writer, she's amazing. I did like a thing for WikDiv, which there was an issue of WikDiv, which was a magazine, and basically the whole structure was like, A, it was a magazine, B, it was designed to highlight Kevin Wadder's art, but all the structure was basically me being a text-based RPG, role-playing with a real-world journalist, and being my characters live, and then they took the transcript and turned it into a real article. And there was a few other things, but she kind of noted, like, not many people could have pulled that off. As in, I used to be a journalist. I used to make magazines. There's a lot of it's not, magazine crap. I used to play 90s text-based RPGs. I used to, I know enough journalists to pull it, get there. All these slightly intersecting skill sets allow me to put, and I was like, oh, right. I mean, I was like, oh, leave me alone, Lee. But like, it took me a while to know she had a point, actually. So kind of with Die, it's like, okay, how can I make this work weirder and denser? Like, what could I do, which I don't think many other writers in comics would do. I always said could then, but it's also would, in terms of like the level of stupidity to make out what's ended up being quite a dense system. That requires a level of like commitment, which is not advisable. I could have probably written a whole extra comic. Like I could have written like another 6-issue comic series at least, rather than do this. But the fact that I'm somebody with my, I've got my background in RPGs and games generally, and I've always wanted to, I should try it. Because like the idea of actually doing an RPG that's a comic and a comic that's an RPG and becoming the exercise felt worth trying. So yeah, my original plan was it to be in the back matter of the comic. So
Oh.
every issue would have some of the rules, and it would like build up, and you could play it. And it's like when I started designing like a full, I realized there's no. Originally, was okay. I'll release a small PDF when the first issue drops, and then I'll build it up. And that didn't happen. Then I realized no, what I've got here is too big. It's just too big, and also more important, there's spoilers in it. So there's like spoilers like issue 5 and along the way. It's just like kind of like, oh no, release it when the trade comes out, and also that gives me another like 8 months of playtesting, and also writing the bloody thing. But the plan sort of now is actually hopefully give some content in the back of every issue. Like I'm not sure what's going in issue 6 yet, but like issue 7, I want to do something about the gods. Like I want to give like the stats for like most of the die gods, and issue 8 like non-player archetypes and stuff like that. You know, just generally something that's fun in the back. Or maybe I'll do some guest columns, like bully someone. You know, when I say bully, I mean pay some designer friends of mine into doing something for me, and then see how it goes. But yeah, it was like it seemed like a logical extension of what I was doing, and for quite a while I wasn't sure what was the lead project, and I worried about that. And I kind of got, as in like, okay, is this a comic or is this an RPG? And is the fact I don't know hurting it? And I did it to a certain point, and eventually realized, oh no, they're the same thing. And in my head, they've kind of merged, and they like grow and they entwined. The Ouroboros, I can never say that word. That the snake eating its own tail. It's kind of one of them now. But I kind of just my thing was I wanted to do a short form RPG. Okay, my first aim was do a short form RPG that basically mechanizes the first arc of Wicked. Sorry, Die. So in other words, we stop. Where Die ends is kind of where the game ends. Like group, go through and make it your own. And in some ways, it's kind of like a showing you're working. I guess as in, okay, this is how I did it internally. Allow me to now, through the medium of mechanics, allow you to do it and make it your own. Like 100% your version, and when I say your version, I mean really your version, as in it's just complete. Like the as in like everything changes in it except for the story structure. It's the idea of like it's something like we all have basically not we all. There's a kind of skeletons are fairly. There's a standard human skeleton bar deviations. But like the idea, here's the game that gives you a skeleton, and then there's all the flesh becomes absolutely a perfect, unique individual. That's kind of what I was trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes sense in a way. It's kind of a way to crystallize your process of creating the story into game mechanics instead of just giving the story complete. More like saying this is how I created the story, and it makes sense with a lot with what you were saying before, that you conceptualize stories already as an RPG or as a game.
Yeah, I mean, like it was a really useful way to kind of like narrow not condense my thinking. Like, as in, okay, can I explain this game well enough for someone else to run it? That was like, as a writer, that was an interesting challenge, especially because as a designer, like I had. For so long when doing the game design, I had lots of different ways to make the facts go. Sorry, the basic game structure is there's a sort of like there's like a world building section. You make a group of people like in the real world, normal people. Then you step away from the table, step down to the table. Then you do a quasi Nordic LARP setup where you kind of like role play with each other and pretend to be the people you've just made up. And then someone gets out a role playing game, and you start playing the people you've made up playing this role playing game. You make your characters. Then you get transported into this fantasy world. And this fantasy world is basically an externalization of most of your fears and hopes and despairs. And at the end, you either go home or not. That's kind of the basic structure. So I've got the question. There was a reason why I said that.
I think we were talking... I don't know. I think we went on a bit of a run there. Yeah. Well, originally, I think the question was about the origin of the idea for the game and the comic, but I think we kind of went away from there a little bit.
Yeah, so I went straight into the RPG. Yeah, sorry.
So talking a little bit about that, someone asked a really cool question in the chat, which I will try to relate as best as possible. They say, Die is in part about the spiritual and totemic relationship players have with their game. The Die RPG is storytelling heavy rather than mechanics number heavy. Do you think there's a separate kind of totemic relationship players of storytelling heavy RPGs, like White Wolf, for example, have two RPGs than players of mechanic heavy RPGs, or does it come down to the same end of inhabiting a world, another persona? Basically, do we develop a sort of relationship with games so that are kind of more storytelling heavy, more story games, that kind of stuff, that with kind of in a different way than what we do with traditional games? And maybe if you want to go into kind of the relationship about the way people totemize their games and all the different instruments and all that.
I think, okay, this is not a question. This is like definitely here is an essay.
Yes.
You saw me doing my kind of I suspect, I apologise for the question. I suspect I'm going to answer a completely different question because this is really big and could be actually like multiple things in there. I think people's relationship with, like, I think the way I'm going to take the question is, how does story influence mechanics? Mechanics influence story? Would that be a fair reading, I guess? Have I gone off?
And the way kind of, I think specifically the way people develop a relationships with the games, with the objects of the game, the stories they tell, and that kind of stuff. But it is it's a complicated question.
Okay, this is literally going off an angle. I found myself also, there's a lot of D&D is by far the most popular RPG system, and up to the level where, especially remember in the 80s, this was never true in the UK, but in America, you used to, it's not I'm going to play a game console, I'm going to play Nintendo, or like I'm going to play Xbox, and the same way D&D has kind of got, I'm going to play D&D.
Yeah,
and when they say D&D, they actually mean RPGs, as in the level of brand equity is as such they become that, and which of course, like as a creative person, I'm immediately I'm fine with D&D. I suspect the current edition is really good, but as a kind of like somebody who likes art forms, that bothers me as much as like Marvel, like comics meaning Marvel and DC. That's just not healthy. But at the same time, there is a certain, anytime anything reaches a concept of real popularity, there's a totemicism to it. As in, like, on dice covers an exploded D20. So the D20 is the icon of RPGs. If you talk to somebody and show that to if they even didn't play RPGs, they probably guess. As in they know enough about RPGs to recognize that. In the same way, if you've never seen a Mickey Mouse cartoon, you recognize the ears. So that kind of totemicism is a quote unquote real thing, even if you never play those games. And that's also something that allows people to empathize with the world more. What I mean is, like, there's some people who, once they've actually internalized the logic of an RPG system or a game, it's easier for them to imprint on the fiction around that mechanics. And it doesn't matter, like, if, say, I don't know, Monster Hearts would give you a better experience in terms of like the social drama. The kind of the buy-in is, this is safe. In some way, like, if I passed you a game controller, if you're familiar with the controls, it means it's easier to play the game, even if the game isn't really built for that controller. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As in, like, if it's a weird controller they don't know how to play, even if if it's perfect for fishing, like that. And that's how I kind of think about it. And like, there's some of Dyer's about weirdly, it's a sort of, I wouldn't say a halfway house, but we're serving masters, as in, like, on one level the game is trying to be a 1991 era dice pool system. As in specifically, what game would a pretentious teenager make in 1991? And White Wolf has just started. Vampire's just come out. Dice pools are the new hot thing. It'd be a dice pool game. But at the same time, I'm bringing in ideas for much later. in the indie storytelling. And at the same time, I'm also trying to fetishize the icons of D&D. I use all the dice. I mean, one of the cool things about the game is the game runs off D6s, but each player owns a dice, as in they're the only person to ever touch that dice. So the idea of treating them like literally in the comic, when the people get the dice, that's when they gain their abilities, and that also happens in the game. And the idea of actually using these totemic objects and like leaning into the weird fantasy of it. So in other words, it's using the icons of pre-1991, but it's sort of like a surface level appearance of a 991 game with looking to the future simultaneously. So it kind of like, that's my way of balancing it. In some ways, even the more, the fact you start with this pure like writer's room thing describing a group of people, then you move to like a Nordic LARP, then you move to something that's actually quite a procedural RPG in many ways. And at the end, you segue into something that's like quasi-fiasco, quasi-endgame of like Power by the, as in it moving through these different modes. And in some ways, it's a kind of a tutorial aspect. I mean, I'm very aware that I was trying to do something that was, it's quite interest in that kind of like, I mean, in terms of like anyone who really plays indie RPGs, a lot of those ideas, they'll go, oh, right, I get this. I've seen this. Well, oh, that's an interesting idea, but etc. I wish you hadn't done that. And there's a kind of like some of the choices I've made are as weird as the game is a little. It's not that weird, and there's enough stuff going on that if you've even just played D&D, you'll go, okay, I get it. The GM does this, the players does this. It's still a fairly objective system as opposed to the hyper subjective systems of like player, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That was my thinking, and I've gone way off now.
No. Apparently, that answered the question.
Hey, thank you. I can't see the questions, so I'm like kind of guessing.
So you mentioned the kind of the LARP aspects and the fetishization of the dice. The dice. So could you talk a little bit about what you were trying to accomplish with that? Because I do find very interesting that kind of using that aspect of LARP of taking objects and putting them like additional meaning into the game and creating this kind of use them to create another reality.
It's like ritual is a really rich. I mean, Wiccan Divine is fundamentally a book about ritual in some ways, but ritual is powerful. I mean, there was a reason. I was reading several books about like the Satanic Panic and like and the was it Dangerous Games, the book? I think Dangerous Games fundamentally argued, there's a really good reason why religious groups were scared of D&D, because it's a bit close to what religious groups are. As in, it's a bit too, it's fundamentally about a magic circle. This is basically about a quotation around, it's about reality. Okay, anyone understands that the concept of bleed, we create the magic circle, we gather together to do this ritual, and we pretend something is both real and not real. And that kind of sacred magical thinking. I was like, I was talking to Alan Moore a few years ago, and I asked, Alan Moore basically the joke, he worships a sock puppet, that kind of like, and everyone jokes about that because, and Alan of course knows, and he's Alan, he winds people up, but and I was trying to, so why, can you explain the sock puppet to me? And he talked about how the cult, and obviously he says they're not, Kieron, they're not idiots, that kind of, they know it's not actually the god, but statues aren't gods, and people pray to statues, but statue, it has one attribute, and the attribute is it looks like them, it's just a statue, it doesn't move, whilst a puppet, it has one thing, it looks like a god, it looks like a little snaky thing, but it also moves, so it's two attributes, it is more like God than a statue is. Ergo, that, and it's like, okay, I was quite drunk at the time, so it's like, no, I get that's true. Like it may be weird, but it's also true.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, you apply that to D&D, like at least part of the design choices, I'm going to use bits of like the shared mythology of like what D&D is as props in the game. So rather than running from it, they're like, okay, D20s are magical. We know that because that's literally the entire, the hobby was born off these weird dice. So this weird ritual. So like the picking up, the moving dice around, the owning of it, the weird like. I mean, literally, there's a very minor mechanic where something called the bad dice. That one dice is ceremonially scapegoated as the worst of all dice. That kind of stuff. But like, this is in the basic edition we've released.
Mhm.
But in the Arcana, which is like my selection of random other ideas that'll probably come out soon, there's this thing called the box of crap. And the box of crap, quotation marks, is basically a box just full of anything, literally anything. But some of the core things I suggested, like old RPG supplements, old monster manuals, old con guides, old miniatures, old character sheets, like your old children diary. And you put it, and anytime you basically want to use it you use it all as a tarot deck. So it's like, okay, we're going to work out what, and you pull out stuff, or you get out a map and you reinterpret that map. So you maybe have a map of an old D&D module, and you look, but you're not looking at it like an actual map, not like the map it was. You're looking at stuff on the map to how could I interpret this, and the idea, imagining, it's all a bit witchy.
Yes, it has this kind of oracular properties.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's the one character class I didn't do, and it's the one I doesn't fit any of them. But I want specifically rune reading as an aspect. But for me, it was also the classic idea of like old school D&D was often the idea of like the GM is over here and they're in control, quote unquote, and the players over here, and that kind of like in modern indie games that's obviously very out of fashion, and rightly so. Most of the games I play are much more like communal GMing things. But there is a weird magic to not knowing what's going on. As in, like, ultimate control is elusive. And the way die tends to work is that you throw stuff out there and then it's twisted. And that's kind of like the idea of like and that's kind of like a kid. That's Kierkegaarden. The idea that there's a gap between us all. We've got to make this leap of faith.
The leap of faith.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, there's what I was trying to make sort of fetishize was, okay, by getting these maps out and you can see what's happening, but you don't know what it means, and that kind of like almost like cosmic horror gap.
Yeah.
So trying to reimagine all the D&D tools, as in, okay, let's make all these creepy. And the great joy is, this is kind of what people were scared of in the 80s, and it's all like, let's make a game that kind of, it's all true. It's always been satanic. Let's go.
Yeah, kind of helping people or challenging people to make that leap of faith and engage with that with the game in that way.
But it's a funny thing. We all kind of know that gaming is magic, and the thing about die is let's pretend it is. Let's actually pretend it's and the fundamental thing about RPGs is it allows us to go into another life briefly and then return, and that's kind of like that's baked into die structure in its way. I mean, like, I've never designed before. Oh, that's not true. I've never released anything I've designed before. So I'm very aware I am a dilettante, and I'm having fun doing it, and I'm taking it very seriously. But like, I don't know what I'm doing. So that's kind of like, it's been incredibly nerve-wracking releasing this PDF and just kind of, so guys, what do you make of it? Which is a journey. So like, I'm not sure what we're going to do next with it. Like, ideally, I certainly have stuff I want to do more, and there's a bunch of other areas, and I would love to get other people to work on the world. And and the thing about this, that's not in the beta, as in there's nothing to do with my actual game, as in apart from the character classes, there's nothing actually of die in there. As in, it's got this one set scenario and kind of built from there. So there's definitely lots of areas to build on there. It's interesting.
So something you mentioned that I think also is really interesting is that these two concepts of the persona and the character that you create as a player. So I wanted to ask you to explain it a little bit and tell us a little bit how it works and why did you decide to include this distinction.
Could you repeat that question, actually?
Sorry,
something happened in another window and I got distracted.
Oh, that's fine. So in the game you have the concept of the persona and the character. So could you try to kind of explain a little bit that distinction and why did you include it?
I hate terminology. This is one because everyone makes them a different word for NPC or PC, and they're ugly words. They're just ugly words, but at the same time they're also clear words. The case of die is the fact it works in multiple realities. In other words, I had to work out an official word for each. So persona is the player is you in the real world, and persona is the real world people you're making. So in other words, I'm going to sit down like I'm Kieron Gillen. My persona will be Margaret, the famous fantasy writer who never actually ever finished a novel. She was like mainly famous for like not finishing novels, and she's estranged from her husband, and her kids don't speak to her anymore, and she just wanted once in her life to finish her bloody novel. And then we have the concept of character, and character is anyone in the fantasy world when they, normally like anyone you meet, but also if you enter the fantasy world of entrance. In other words, she enters the fantasy world and then is transformed to rage, a rage knight, etc., who has these special abilities. So, in other words, player is who you are, persona is the personality you are, and character is the body you inhabit when you're exploring the world. Of course, it's not quite that simple, as in like, but that's how I explain it. As in, because character is actually also everybody inside Die. Like anybody you actually meet in the game is a character because the rules apply equally to everybody. And like the only differences between players and non-player characters is they have their dice. The rule that's kind of like because it was quite important for the. It's weird because obviously I play a lot of mainly narrative games, and I went all the way back to doing an objective simulationist system because it's like this is a game about whether it's real or not. And if the mechanics say everyone you meet aren't as real as you, by definition they're not as real as you. So in other words, to speak to the narrative theme of nature of reality, the game had to be at least pretend to be objective, which is a weird way to get around to it. And of course, the other reason is, as I said earlier, it's slightly more familiar to anyone who's come from D&D. Like, as in they understand objective systems, as in, okay, you move, I move, whatever. But the real philosophy way of doing it is that kind of like, okay, all characters are equal. So there's actually another term called avatar, as in, a character who's controlled by a persona, it's called an avatar. But we've never used that. We use that in the intro, and we never use it again. It's one of those kind of like, we may need this variable, but we're not in this set of rules, thankfully. And it's fun because, like, so much of the game is, let's say you go into a fantasy world, but like the reason why you do the whole character generation stuff is so you can, the persona's life life and hopes and fears and desires gets folded into the game. It's that kind of the example is like, what's that person lacking in their real life, and they go into the fantasy world and they'll have a chance to like symbolically have that, or be like, or if like if they're estranged from the ex, someone in the fantasy world will be a bit like their ex, so it's all about their the persona's messed upness coming to the surface, and the metaphor becomes physical in the fantasy world, which is really fun. I mean, the other thing, there's also techniques like, you do a lot of flashbacks. So at the same time, you do as a GM, or as a player, you might. Okay, tell me about the first time you kissed somebody, or tell me the first time you were drunk, and then you go back to persona level and you make up anything up. I mean, like the classic sort of die rhythm is like me asking it, like if I was GMing, it'd be like someone's character just gets shot or something, and I was like, has your persona ever actually been hurt? And they go, oh yeah, I was in a car crash once, I broke my leg. And okay, this hurts exactly like that. And that's a really it's all like there's various things like you always go back to the persona, because if you don't, it becomes about the characters. So you all the way through the game, you remind it, no, this is about the people in the real world using this fantasy to explore parts of themselves. And of course, on the meta level, that's all RPGs ever. And that's how I try to think, because it's always back to the persona. That's the kind of like the heart of the game. As much as I really like the mechanics, like the character classes are pretty cool in a geeky way, but it's all about like that big emotionalness of it. And there's some wonderful bits when you run it. Like, I mean, when I've run it, I really enjoyed it. And it's like, it's weird. I don't know if you've ever actually designed the system, but watching like videos of people play the game and seeing them do the ritual, I'm like, it's very nice.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting element in Die of both the RPG and the comic, of this kind of reflexiveness on like the fantasy, the nostalgia, the kind of things we used to play, and even of playing an RPG where it's like a story game looking back into traditional games.
Yes, yeah. It's like, I mean, I was like, because it's like there's a reason why at the back of the beta, but I want to do more of this. In that there's a lot of plugs of like, here's some really good games I've liked, and it could have been longer. And it's that kind of like, this is a comment, like, that's what I love about Fantasy Heartbreak as a phrase. Like, Fantasy Heartbreak, obviously, it was a Forge era term. And the idea that these games that existed out of conversation with all other games. And of course, Die isn't. I've done my research and I've tried to do something which I feel is aesthetically coherent as much as I can make it. And I might change my mind next week. But the idea of like doing something that's about the whole history of RPGs a bit. And that kind of comes like, if we go back to the comic, which isn't as much in the RPG, but like Die is set on enormous 20-sided dice. And every single region of every like triangle on the die is a completely different kingdom. So like, this kingdom is the Tolkien kingdom. This is like Lovecraft. This is, and I don't just do a straight homage. I do a really strong riff, by which I mean like the Tolkien region is basically Hobbiton on the Western Front. So you've got like basically the awful image of like those green doors buried into the mud. And it's of course it's just talking about how Mordor. I've not seen the movie Tolkien yet, but in a very clear way, that's what this is about. So all the regions of the Die comic I've made are about that. They're about a dialogue and a conversation. And it's basically a world just made by a critic. And some of that goes back into the comic as well, and so the game as well. Like, the game does it a little bit more cleanly, and it kind of like puts the agency back on the player. I mean, like there's something actually I think I've said it earlier, but the Die RPG will explicitly say all the games of Die happen inside their own pocket dimension. And in other words, Die itself is full of pocket dimensions. So in other words, every single game of Die is canon because you are inside a tiny dimension, and you want to make like it's there. Like Ash and all the other characters might just walk past it one day. And I've got a place I know exactly where on Die I'm putting these worlds. So like eventually we're going to get there. But that's fun. You know what I mean? That's a big. As a kid, like I remember when I was very into Tolkien as a Middle Earth role playing was my first game, and there's a reason for that. But the fundamental disappearing into it aspect, you know what I mean? That's still kind of seductive. The disappearing into it, and that's kind of what Die's about. As why on earth did I like this stuff so much? There's a Tolkien quote which I hit when I was researching issue 3. I won't be able to get it right, but it's like it was basically dismissing people who are dismissing escapism because they are confusing the escape of a prisoner. Sorry, they're confusing the escape of a deserter with the escape of a prisoner. In other words, people who are against escapism are implying that they are deserters, while of course in reality, they could be prisoners. And that's a really powerful quote. Like, and especially somebody who was served on the Western Front, like deserter is loaded for them as well. And that's kind of like the dialogue between those two ideas. I think is quite key.
And that, I guess that kind of this whole reflective aspect of the game fits into the kind of the central question at the end of it, which is, do you want to go home or do you want to stay? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that means to you.
It's a good question. I tell you what, it's like there's do you go home or do you stay? It's like what have we learned from this experience? Is it just that we want to be here, or can we take things back from fantasy? I mean, like one of the traditional Die game, it's assuming they go home, that's a big assumption, to be honest. There's what normally happens in the games I've ran is that you get the unpacking. So, you ask the player, how did this experience change your life? And they go and they talk about like, oh, I started to do this and this and this, and it's always about, okay, here's something weird that's happened to me. What do I do with it? And in some ways, that's a really positive way to think about it. Like, I read this novel. What did I do? What did I, it's supposed to just escape, because like I've never had anyone say, I just go back to my day job. It's always, this experience changed me. And that's kind of like what I think that's I wouldn't say hard built into the game, but it seems to be a theme that comes up quite naturally with players, as in they want the experience to be meaningful. And that's what you might say is like, it doesn't matter whether you go home or not. It's like, was this experience meaningful? I don't know. Yeah, I think the answer is mostly yes, I guess. Because if that's not the addictive part. That's a loaded word. That's an interesting part of it, anyway.
And I think that's fundamental to a lot, if not most stories. That aspect of the protagonist going from the known to the unknown, descending into the dungeon and coming back, change. I think that's a fundamental aspect of almost every story.
No, I agree, absolutely. This is classical story structure. It's like story is change, I guess. And it's, I might have been overbuilding the concept of what RPGs do. But like the idea of like, here's a thing that happened, and it's like, okay, how would this have changed? And people like thinking, even if they don't actually change their real life, they like thinking about how life could change. And it's like one of the very small mechanics in. I mean, I've said earlier, it's actually the GM the players say something, the GM responds is kind of a core die method. And in the end game, it's quite often like the players will say something, and then the GM adds a grace note, and it's a grace note increasing what they meant. I mean, it's like, and it's often quite like a quiet supernatural grace note, like if they'd lost a lover in die, like a message appearing or something like that. In other words, and it adds to the thing. It's never like you never counteract that. It's yes-anding in improv terms. As always, as a GM, you want to be okay. This is how they want their story to end. Let's make it. Let's turn up the volume a bit. If they haven't, and if this is I think the thing which some story games, I wouldn't say lack, because frankly you gain so much from doing it other ways. But there is a magic by someone else telling it to you. But and the magic there is like me saying I love me to myself isn't interesting, but me saying I love you, it's like that's powerful. So if you manage to slightly externalize your own beliefs and someone reflects it back at you, that's a moment. And that's actually one of the best things about being a comic creator. Like if you're a novelist, you just sit there and write, and then the story sits on the page exactly like you wrote it. Not imagined it, wrote it. As a comic writer, you write a script, give it to an artist, and a month back, it'll come back, and it'll be simultaneously your story and also not your story. So you're both like the author and also an observer. And for me, or at least I've only just realized this talking to you now. That's what I'm trying to do with Die. As in, that's kind of like me looking at the classical GM player axis and trying to turn it into something more about reflecting the player's own desires back at them and trying to give people what I get from being a comic writer. All right, that's actually a bit of a breakthrough, actually. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. So we are kind of running a little bit out of time. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions from the chat and then kind of a couple of mine. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but I don't want to take too much time. So we have one about Alan Moore. Of course, you should mention Alan Moore. Someone was going to ask something about it. I think this is something you mentioned in the game. You warned us not to make Alan Moore a lich.
Alan would kill me. Alan is immortal, all powerful, and also liches are evil. Alan Moore's a delightful man.
So is Alan Moore the Grandmaster? Or...
No. He's just he's like the real world master.
Cool. And one about a little bit of, like a small detail about the story. There's a big reveal related to the Fallen in the issue 5, which is really, really cool. And in the chat they're asking if that was part of like an early idea that you had in Dash development, or where that kind of idea came.
So I mentioned earlier about the Die RPG and the Die comic feeding back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually the Fallen is actually the best or the single biggest idea that came from that. I think I'd actually already written issue 1, like the first, because the Fallen turned up in issue in issue 1 in the first draft. It moved to issue 2 later, and I was like, and all I had, they were basically something created by the Fair, and the Fair weren't even called the Fair then. who create the Neotech. And I just wanted this sort of like Tetsuo the Iron Man-esque monster. And they're called the Fallen because that's a really good name. I got interested in falling from the sky, and I was riffing on like my Catholic past. So it already existed as the Fallen, and then blah blah blah. Go over to the RPG, and I'm playing with the concept of like the basic thing about the game is everyone's want to go home. If they and they've got to come to an agreement somehow, and then either positively or negatively, and it's in a murder is not an impossibility, as in it's a game where from the beginning it's like, oh no, this could turn nasty. But the whole kind of like, okay, what player elimination is really boring, and they've got a game around what's the point of that? And then it was like, oh no, obviously like killing, hitting. Let's make the people you kill get up again, but they just lose their vote. And then, of course, they have to, and then they've got to kill the other people to get it back, yada yada, And so it follows quite. But anyways, oh yeah, and they're called the Fallen, aren't they? And immediately it's that kind of like, oh no, I'd already like. That's the kind of the spookiness of it, as in that it fits together. As in, I'd already done the groundwork and the world building for this idea. So and Fallen is such a loaded word. Like on some level, did I subconsciously know that? Or later, and that's the kind of like Die in terms of writing. It's been such a weird project in that so much stuff has just been kind of lying there and felt I don't use the word lightly, predestined, as in like an evil Lovecraftian intelligence was guiding me. I mean, if you've read the back of issue 5's essays, like I'd forgotten I forgot my teenage username was Sol. Like I'd genuinely forgotten that until like about a week before writing that essay. And that implies there's a lot of stuff going on here I'm not sure of. And that's kind of like fantasy is tricky. Fantasy is literally subconscious meets conscious and this liminal state we explore and exploring us. That's creepy and that's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of descending into the dungeon on the back of your mind. And and when you get back, some things are stuck with you.
Yeah. Things like, actually, I must admit, I've said the Fallen is something I'm really happy with, as in like, oh yeah, that's perfect. And that's really perfect. As in, especially the way we go with it down the line.
Yeah, and I can see how that grow out of a game necessity when designing the RPG, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a wonderful example. It's literally the fact that, I said earlier, like, you spent so much time thinking about both the comic and the RPG separately. They feed into each other. And so, like, the fact you're thinking about them, like even stuff like the emotion knights, like there's this class called the emotion knights, and there's 8 emotions, and each one, and they've these kind of core abilities, but they're all kind of extrapolations of a core concept. And thinking about actually, okay, how would this ability work with this emotion? And you go all the way around the bottom, and you sort of realise stuff like joy knights. Oh no, they're monsters, and that's only because of the way you've come through the rules. And then you realize, oh, I say grief knights aren't that bad at all because of this, and stuff like terror knights. Oh, that means you're going to be constantly afraid. And terror knights are terrible. You've got to corner a terror knight to make them fight you. All that kind, and also the fact that always say people purge their emotion as they use the weapons. In other words, the terror knight basically would move between basically running away, then using all their powers, and then they're not scared anymore. Then they could fight, and now they're scared again. And they're kind of like you end up having to think through it systemically. And being a game designer has forced me to do a lot more, which is fun and a giggle.
Yeah, it sounds a really interesting process of kind of constantly reevaluating the story from the point of view of the mechanics.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, it's like what would be cool? You know what I mean? Like, does this feel solid and interesting and amusing? And that also, like, will players get a kick out of it as well? Is this an interesting character to explore? I mean, it's funny. It's like in the game, like Godbinder is a class, which is kind of a more clericus demonologist is the way I phrase it as. Like it's almost all the way through the game, you're talking to gods. So in other words, just your GM is pretending to be a god talking to you, and that gods are like, I normally play them quite broad, so like they're deliberately quite over the top and quite often funny or at least sinister, and just trying to talk a god into God, can you please open this door, God? Why should I open this door? Just open the door and I'll build you a temple. Will it be a golden temple? Yes, it'll be a golden temple with big horns. Great. Door open. Better have my temple. It's a fun time. I bet you mean that's not even mechanic-y. That's really small mechanics, but also an interesting dynamic. Hopefully.
And something you mentioned before is the idea that every RPG, every die game is canon in a way with the RPG. Have you thought about incorporating some of the stuff people are going to develop with their own games in a way into the comic, or like using it in a way, or like collecting it in a way, or something like that?
I think in the comic how to phrase this. I think in the comic that creates legal issues. You know what I mean? As in, like, it's deliberately like that's why they're in pocket dimensions. So, in other words, oh no, you can do what you want. It's nothing to do with me. It's like, you know,
sure,
you're in here, and that's fine, but I'm not you. But like, you know, especially, I must say, I think it's probably. I must say, I'm lying. There's probably room for like people to do their own. If I commission someone to write a dice story. Like that's feasible, and it's more like it's definitely like I could commission someone to do like a supplement or something, you know. And I kind of like want to do, because despite die being a very improvisational at the moment, it's very improvisational structure, but I kind of want to do some like more guided structures as well, and you know, maybe commission some people would be fun, because you know I'm only one person, so like not enough time. But B, like more voices are good, you know. Like as much as like I think die as a big burst of my head is interesting. It's also really interesting to see other people's takes on the area, you know. And it's always interesting to read that stuff.
Is there stuff that you have already planned to include in future versions of the game?
Like I wouldn't say planned. It's that kind of like it's more like there's obvious stuff that's missing. You know what I mean? Like there's no character advancement. There's no campaign system. The rules feature nothing about my world of die. So in other words, like if you actually wanted to do, okay, I want to go and adventure in the same place Ash is adventuring in, like you can't do that. You know, they're the really big obvious stuff, and that's the kind of stuff which turns it from like 150 pages to 400 pages. You know, like a general world building section. I like it to be better balanced. I like just some more finesse. Like it's a lot of it's finesse, like some more details. Yeah, I mean a lot of it's like just really like in terms of like some other mechanic. There's other stuff in character classes which comes down the line. I would like to add to it. Like there's certain things I want to do with fools, and certain things like some special abilities based. You know, I said earlier that like all the emotion knight abilities are based around their emotion, their specific emotion, as in and the relationship to set rules. I would like some more special abilities based on each individual knight. So, in other words, like a rage knight has something more specific to rage knights rather than just what the mechanic says, I guess. But you know, it's like, yeah, mainly character advancement and world stuff. That's the main stuff, I guess, and like how to run the game longer. At the moment, you know, doing it more than 4 sessions, you have to start hacking it. Which is fine. You know, 4 sessions is quite a long time, and you know, hacking it isn't that hard.
Cool. So to kind of wrap things up, something I usually ask is if you could tell us some issue, some difficulty that you found while developing the game, and how did you approach solving it? To kind of learn a little bit from the experience.
Wow. I'll tell you what, the hardest thing about die is, of course, you make this group of people like Persona, and then you drag them to a fantasy world, and the fantasy world has to be an extrapolation of their personas, like lacks, and then so the end was always fine, as in the mechanic of going home was fine, and the setup with a degree of polishing was. The problem was what do they do? As in, okay, how can I explain to anybody, not even just like experienced story gamers, as in like people who've just like downloaded a free die RPG, how to make, you know, as in like genuinely, this might be the first RPG manual they've read. How can I explain this to them? So I basically made up a load of tactics. Like there was about 5 or 6 different methods. And they're all in the Arcana, which is, as I said, the add-on thing I haven't released yet. And all of them worked for some groups, and none of them worked for all groups. and and then I hit a group in playtests, and I don't know if most of my personas have been really strong characters, so I've been easy to like riff on. So otherwise, I riff quite hard. So I've dropped people in like an evil music festival. I've dropped people in the con they're at, So I've used a lot of real world environments turned weird and lots of things. And this group were quite low key. They hadn't given me much, and I was like, oh god, I've got nothing to give them. There's nothing interesting. So I had something at heart, and then I was okay. I'll just drop them into their teenage fantasy world. I'll just take their teenage D&D game and drop them there and then twerk it. Not twerk it, but tweak it. Twerking it. That's an interesting image. Tweaking it. And immediately it was like, oh no, and all the other methods are now obsolete. Like, this method works for everybody. And so the rest are immediately put in the back. So they're removed from the manual and put somewhere else. And it's like, okay, this is the core method because it's simplest and it works. And that was kind of like, and that actually annoyed me. It took me a long time to realize that. As in, oh no, this is the easiest idea. I should have realized this a long time ago. And that's kind of it, I guess. As in, like, don't be afraid to throw out a lot of work if what you've got is what you need. And it's like simplifying is usually better. Like, and deciding, what is the core thing you're actually trying to do with the game, and do the core thing, and everything else is pushed to the sides, like that. Like, I'm not, I'm quite. Dai's design is quite maximalist. I'm not Avery Adler. I'm not that elegant. But at the same time, it's like being able to sort of edit, as in, oh no, this is a good idea. I don't need it here. Put it over here. That's the core thing. As in, like, there's a famous line, "Kill your darlings." In writing, kill your darlings, as in,
oh yeah,
okay, yeah, I love this thing, but it breaks the story structure, and I've got to remove it for the sake of the task. That, as in, don't be afraid to kill your darlings. And in game design, it's even harder because it's options, but options are also choices, and it's that kind of like, and the more choice, and there's only so many choices human brains can handle. That's what I meant. I know.
Cool. And to finish off, could you tell us a cool short story that you've experienced from playing the game, playtesting it?
As in Dai?
Yeah.
Oh wow. I'm trying to think what's good. Oh man, I can't choose an individual one.
And in the meantime, I'm going to send all the links to find all your stuff on the chat.
I'll tell you what, actually, this is quite an early playtest, but this is one of the first ones which worked like I wanted it to. As in, I've had darker or weirder stories and more personal stories, but this one is like the full character. I wouldn't say went completely catatonic, but they almost completely withdrew. They went to the world and everything was just too weird for them. It was just too weird, and so they never used any of their abilities ever. And like the rest of the group kind of basically carried them through. And the background is it was at a con, so she was a werewolf / fic writer. And the master who dragged them in was another like fanfic writer, and basically the world they'd been dragged to was basically her fanfic, and also like slightly warped versions of them as the love interests. So that kind of like, oh no, both her and this other girl were both in the closet, clearly, and then the subtext the whole game. And it led to the conclusion as these enormous monsters are fighting. These two young queer women basically come, let's go for a coffee sometime. As it, and there's like the level of like, oh no, this is simultaneously really heartfelt and lovely, but at the same time it's got the scale of like the ludicrousness of RPGs. And like I said, there's some stuff of Dai that's gone weirder and bigger, and there's stuff of Dai that has gone much more quiet and intimate, and like families holding each other. But what I love about that moment is it was both in this kind of like, we're lost in this apocalyptic worldview of like my fanfic gone mad, and I'm just trying to find a way to actually agree on going on a date. That was lovely.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I think that's going to be it for the interview. Thanks everyone for being in the chat, and I hope you enjoy it. If so, I'll remind you to please consider following us on Twitch, becoming a subscriber. If you have an Amazon Prime account that you're not using, that's a really a good way to do it for free. And subscribe to YouTube, follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and all of that. Oh yeah, let me send you all the links on the chat as well. Yeah, thanks a lot, Kieron, for being here today. It was really, really great talking with you and really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been lovely to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And I actually really recommend people to take the opportunity to buy the first volume of Die, which is already out very recently. Yes, do the very well. It's a really, really cool story, and it's a really really interesting game, and I'm really excited to see how it develops. So
thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for having me again.
And with that, thanks everyone. I hope to see you soon. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. See you next time.